the North Atlantic, in the winter of 1942. A freezing mist rolls across the black water like a shroud, reducing visibility to mere feet. Somewhere beneath those waves, a German U-boat commander peers through his periscope, watching the ghostly silhouettes of Allied merchant ships pass overhead. For him, the fog is a gift from the gods of war, a cloak of invisibility that renders him virtually untouchable. For the Allied convoy steaming above, it's a death sentence waiting to be delivered. This was the reality of the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. From 1939 to 1945, German U-boats prowled these waters like wolves, sinking over 3,000 Allied ships and claiming the lives of more than 72,000 sailors and merchant seamen. The odds were brutally simple. If the Allies couldn't see the submarines hunting them, they couldn't fight back. And more often than not, they couldn't see them. Radar technology, still in its infancy, struggled mightily against the atmospheric chaos of the Atlantic. Heavy fog, rain squalls, and the spray of rough seas rendered early radar systems nearly useless. Even when conditions were favorable, radar could only detect submarines on the surface. Once a U-boat dove beneath the waves, it effectively vanished from the electronic eye of Allied technology. The challenge facing Allied Naval Command was seemingly insurmountable. How do you find something you can't see? Something specifically engineered to be invisible? Something that operates in a three-dimensional environment where traditional warfare tactics simply didn't apply? The answer would come not from radar screens or visual spotters, but from an unlikely source that predated all modern technology, the ancient human sense of hearing. The solution to the U-boat menace lay hidden in the ocean itself, traveling through the water as invisible waves of pressure, sound. While it might seem obvious in hindsight, the systematic use of acoustic detection to hunt submarines represented a revolutionary leap in naval warfare. The British had been developing their ASDIC system, named for the Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, since the final days of the First World War. But it wasn't until the desperate circumstances of World War II that acoustic submarine hunting truly came into its own. Enter the unsung heroes of this story, the acoustic operators, sometimes called submarine detectors, or more colorfully known as ping merchants. These weren't your typical sailors. They were specialized technicians trained to operate sophisticated hydrophone equipment that could detect the faintest whispers of sound traveling through the Atlantic depths. Picture a young rating, fresh from training, hunched over his equipment in a cramped compartment aboard a pitching destroyer. He wears headphones pressed tight against his ears, his eyes closed in concentration as he listens to sounds that most people would never even know existed. The science behind their work was both simple and profound. Sound travels through water approximately 4 times faster than it does through air, roughly 1,500 meters per second compared to 340 in atmosphere. This physical property meant that a trained operator could detect a submarine at ranges that would be impossible through visual observation. The ASDIC system worked by transmitting a focused beam of sound, operating typically at 20 kilohertz, right at the upper edge of human hearing, into the water. This pulse would travel outward, and when it struck something solid like a submarine's hull, it would bounce back as an echo. But here's where it gets fascinating. The technology was only half the equation. Early acoustic equipment was crude, temperamental, and prone to giving false readings. Under ideal conditions, an ASDIC set might detect a submarine at ranges up to 2,000 yards, but ideal conditions were rare in the North Atlantic. The real breakthrough wasn't in the equipment itself. It was in the extraordinary human beings trained to interpret what they heard. These operators became the human interface between raw acoustic data and actionable military intelligence. They were, in essence, translating the language of the ocean into the coordinates of life and death. The initial skepticism from Naval Command was understandable. How could sailors wearing headphones possibly locate submarines more effectively than radar or visual spotting? The concept seemed almost mystical, like asking fortune tellers to predict where the enemy would strike next. But desperate times demanded innovative solutions. And as the U-boat campaign intensified through 1941 and 1942, the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy began investing heavily in acoustic detection training programs. What they created was nothing short of remarkable. The transformation of an ordinary sailor into an acoustic operator was an intense, grueling process that bordered on the unbelievable. Veterans of the ASDIC training program described it as one of the most psychologically demanding experiences of their entire service. The training began with theoretical instruction about sound propagation, submarine construction, and the technical specifications of detection equipment. But that was merely the foundation. The real training focused on developing what can only be described as superhuman auditory perception. Commander Welland, the Royal Canadian Navy's top anti-submarine expert, ran his training facility with an iron fist and zero tolerance for mistakes. His philosophy was brutally simple. If you couldn't handle the pressure in training, you'd crack under fire when the lives of hundreds of men depended on your accuracy. Trainees spent weeks at the attack table, a sophisticated mock-up that simulated convoy operations with multiple escort ships, columns of merchant vessels, and attacking U-boats under varying weather and water conditions. Welland and his staff would create impossible scenarios: submarines attacking from multiple directions, equipment malfunctions, overlapping acoustic signatures, and then scream at the operators as they struggled to maintain contact in direct attacks. The psychological toll was immense. Many trainees were driven to tears by the relentless pressure. Some washed out entirely, unable to cope with the demands of the training regime. But those who survived emerged as something approaching acoustic savants. They learned to filter out the cacophony of background noise, the thrashing of their own ship's propellers, the grinding of merchant vessel engines in the convoy, the crash of waves against the hull, even the biological sounds of whales and dolphins. From this chaotic symphony, they had to isolate the specific acoustic signatures of enemy submarines. What made this even more remarkable was the specificity they achieved. Different U-boat types produced different sound signatures based on their engine designs, propeller configurations, and hull shapes. A Type 70 U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, produced a distinctly different acoustic profile than a Type 9 long-range boat. Experienced operators claimed they could identify not just the class of submarine, but sometimes even estimate its depth and speed based purely on the characteristics of the sound they detected. When a U-boat's commander shut down his diesel engines and switched to electric motors for silent running, acoustic operators could detect the subtle change in frequency and rhythm. The training culminated in actual at-sea exercises in St. Margaret's Bay, off Halifax, where trainees worked against Dutch submarines simulating U-boat tactics. For 10 days and nights, operators would track submarines as they dove, wheeled, and sat silently on the bottom, trying to evade detection. Each mistake brought scathing criticism. Each successful contact brought grudging acknowledgement. By the end of this crucible, the survivors had developed an almost preternatural ability to hear submarines. Some operators reported that even in their sleep, they could hear the phantom pinging of their ASDIC transmissions. The sound had become so ingrained in their consciousness that it invaded their dreams. Understanding how these acoustic operators actually prosecuted attacks against U-boats reveals the deadly precision of their craft. When an ASDIC operator detected a submarine, he wasn't simply hearing a vague noise in the distance. Through careful manipulation of his equipment, he could determine bearing, range, and with experience, even the depth and movement of the target. The operator controlled a transmitter housed in a retractable dome beneath the ship's hull, typically positioned directly under the bridge. This transmitter could be trained in a sweeping arc, sending out pulses every few seconds as the operator listened intently for echoes. When contact was established, the operator would immediately report to the bridge. The information flowed rapidly, bearing to target, estimated range, movement characteristics. In convoy operations, multiple escort vessels equipped with ASDIC could triangulate a U-boat's position with remarkable accuracy. If one destroyer detected a submarine on a bearing of 035 degrees at 1,500 yards, and a corvette on the convoy's flank simultaneously detected the same target at a different angle, basic geometry could pinpoint the U-boat's location with deadly precision. This coordination transformed acoustic detection from a defensive tool into an offensive weapon. The attack procedures that followed were carefully choreographed dances of death. In the early years of the war, depth charges were the primary anti-submarine weapon. These were essentially large drums filled with high explosives, set to detonate at specific depths. A destroyer would run directly over the suspected position of a U-boat, rolling depth charges from stern racks while side throwers hurled additional charges to create a pattern designed to bracket the target. The challenge was maintaining acoustic contact while simultaneously closing to attack range. A destroyer's own propeller noise would often drown out the submarine's signature as the escort accelerated for the attack run. This is where the human element became crucial. A skilled ASDIC operator had to maintain contact as long as possible, feeding constant updates to the bridge about any changes in the submarine's position or depth. The operator's last reported bearing before losing contact would guide the depth charge pattern. Combat records from early 1942 showed that the lethal probability of a single depth charge pattern was approximately 3%. To sink a U-boat often required multiple attacks over many hours, with the acoustic operator re-establishing contact after each run and guiding the escort back to the target. The introduction of the Hedgehog weapon in 1943 revolutionized the acoustic operator's effectiveness. Unlike conventional depth charges dropped from the stern, the Hedgehog was a forward-throwing spigot mortar that fired 24 contact-fused projectiles ahead of the attacking ship. This meant the escort didn't have to pass directly over the submarine to attack, allowing the ASDIC operator to maintain contact throughout the entire engagement. The results were dramatic. Out of 5,174 British depth charge attacks, there were approximately 85 confirmed kills, a ratio of about 60 attacks per kill. The Hedgehog, by contrast, achieved 268 attacks with 47 confirmed kills, nearly tripling the effectiveness ratio. Historical accounts record numerous instances where acoustic operators directly enabled U-boat kills. In foggy conditions where visual detection was impossible, ASDIC operators would detect submarines attempting to infiltrate convoys, guiding escorts to the threat before torpedoes could be launched. In night actions, when U-boats preferred to attack on the surface using their superior speed, acoustic operators using passive hydrophone listening could detect the cavitation noise of submarine propellers and vector destroyers onto targets that were otherwise invisible in the darkness. The synergy between trained human perception and technology created a hunting capability that gradually turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. As the war progressed and technology advanced, the role of the acoustic operator evolved but never became obsolete. Even as more sophisticated sonar systems entered service, the human element remained critical. The principles these wartime operators pioneered, differentiating signal from noise, recognizing specific acoustic signatures, triangulating position through multiple bearings, became foundational to modern anti-submarine warfare. Today's sonar operators on nuclear submarines and surface combatants are direct descendants of those WWII-era ping merchants, using vastly more sophisticated equipment but applying fundamentally similar analytical skills. The legacy of these acoustic operators extends beyond military applications. Their work contributed to the broader scientific understanding of underwater acoustics, sound propagation in the ocean environment, and the characteristics of man-made noise in marine settings. Post-war developments in oceanography, marine biology, and underwater communication all built upon knowledge gained during the desperate struggle against the U-boats. The SOSUS system, the sound surveillance system deployed during the Cold War to track Soviet submarines, represented a direct evolution of wartime acoustic detection principles, scaled up to continental proportions. But perhaps the most profound legacy is what these operators demonstrated about human potential. They proved that through intensive training and dedication, human sensory perception could be refined to extraordinary levels. They showed that in an age of increasing mechanization and automation, the human element remained indispensable. The technology provided the tools, but it was human intelligence, human adaptability, and human perseverance that transformed those tools into effective weapons. In an era when artificial intelligence and autonomous systems dominate modern warfare, there's something deeply instructive about remembering that some of the most effective submarine hunters in history were young sailors armed with nothing more than headphones and the ability to truly listen. The Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately won through multiple factors: improved convoy tactics, long-range air cover, intelligence from Enigma decryption, and enhanced weaponry. But threading through all these elements were the acoustic operators, the men who could find submarines in conditions where finding them should have been impossible. They turned fog from a liability into an irrelevance. They made darkness transparent. They proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one that makes the loudest noise, but the one that enables you to hear the whispers of your enemy. In the fog of war, when visibility dropped to zero and traditional tactics failed, these operators provided the eyes, or rather the ears, that kept Allied convoys safe and sent U-boats to the bottom. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as a footnote in naval history, but as a testament to human ingenuity triumphing over impossible odds.